If you had to guess, would you say that this is a town or a village? It's got less than 400 people living in it. It's got a little church. It's got a little pub. I think most people would say that this looks like a classic English village, but it's not. This is actually Fordwich in Kent, which is England's and actually Britain's smallest town. You can tell it's a town because they have a town council and they meet in a town hall. We like to think that there's a really clear hierarchy to these things. If you've got a small collection of houses, we would call that a hamlet. If it grows a little bit and gets a church, then we might call that a village. If it keeps growing, then at some point clearly it becomes a town, and when it gets a cathedral, that's when it becomes a city. But actually none of that is true in the modern legal framework, which makes you wonder, what actually is a village then? And if this is England's smallest town, then what does England's largest village look like? It looks like this. This is Lancing in West Sussex on the south coast. The population here is 28,000, but it's still considered a village. You can tell it's a village because it has a parish council and they meet in a parish hall. So what are the rules here exactly? How can Lancing be 70 times the population of Fordwich, but still be a village? At what point would it stop being a village and start being a town? Well, Fordwich Town Council actually has some info on their website about that. They say that Fordwich's right to style itself a town dates from 1184, when King Henry II granted it a merchant guild charter, reflecting its importance as the de facto port for Canterbury. And that does tend to be the way that a lot of towns were established back in the olden days. At some point, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, they were given maybe a town charter or the right to hold a market, and from then on they had the right to call themselves a town. Lancing never got one of those charters. It's just a weird quirk of history. For one reason or another, this place got skipped over and now it's stuck as a village. There's just one problem with that though. That whole concept of town charters and market towns was thrown in the bin during the Victorian era. The government abolished Fordwich's original corporation, which was kind of the equivalent of a town council back then. So for a while, Fordwich actually lost its status as a town, and it didn't get it back until the 1970s, when the current system of local government in England was set up. So all we need to do then is go and have a look at the law that set up the current system of local government, and it will have some kind of definition that will tell us what is the difference between a village and a town. The first thing to understand is that in our modern system, that hierarchy of village, town, city doesn't really exist. Town and village are just different names for the lowest level of local government, which is actually called a parish. So whether a place is considered a town or a village, it doesn't actually make any real difference. But okay, even if those words don't technically mean anything, to us they still have very different meanings. So what is the actual definition? Well, the Local Government Act of 1972 does have an answer. The council of a parish, which is not grouped with any other parish, may resolve that the parish shall have the status of a town. So forget about the charter from 1184, forget about the population, forget about how big it is. The reason that Fordwich today is England's smallest town is actually just because when it got its council in the 1970s, that council decided that it should be a town. Which makes me wonder about Lancing. If Lancing is England's largest village, that's only because it hasn't decided to become a town. If Lancing Parish Council wanted to, they could just declare that Lancing is now a town, and that would be the end of it. So why haven't they done that? Well, for one thing, there is the historical precedent. They can make a decent case that because they were never given town status under the old system, they're just kind of honouring that by continuing to be a village under the new system. But also, it allows these places to have a way more interesting and unique identity. Instead of Lancing just being another coastal town, it's England's largest village, and instead of Fordwich being just another village, it's England's smallest town. But if towns and villages can just decide to become one or the other at any time, what would happen if you took this system to its most extreme and absurd conclusion? So far we've been looking at places that are right on the boundary between a village and a town, but now let's have a look at the next level up, the boundary between a town and a city. Unlike becoming a town, becoming a city requires the approval of the UK government, and the tradition that's developed in recent years is that every so often, usually to mark a royal jubilee or something like that, the government holds a competition where places all over the UK can submit bids explaining why they think they should become a city. And then a few of those bids are selected and those places get to become cities. It's a weird system, But then again, being a city doesn't really change anything. You don't get more funding or extra powers or anything like that. But it also leads to some weird situations because sometimes there isn't an obvious entity that city status can be awarded to. So I recently made a video about Milton Keynes, and in that video I said, this, I believe, is the edge of Milton Keynes. I think it's a bit debatable because there's like different limits of where people say Milton Keynes starts and ends. And that's because when Milton Keynes was given city status, that status technically went to the borough of Milton Keynes, which includes the urban area itself, but it also includes a load of farmlands and smaller settlements that most people wouldn't really think of as part of Milton Keynes. And in fact, Fordwich, the smallest town in Britain, is technically also part of the city of Canterbury because that city includes Canterbury itself, but also a load of the surrounding area all the way up to the coast. City status is a weird thing. Anyway, I'm in Northampton right now, which is a very big town in the East Midlands, and they've been trying to become a city for quite a while. They've bid for it 4 times, and they've been unsuccessful every time. But Northampton's urban area has a population of about 250,000, which means it's already bigger than many of Britain's cities. It's bigger than Oxford, it's bigger than Cambridge, it's bigger than York. And obviously the reason that they're bidding for city status is because of the prestige that it would bring. Although it might not mean much on paper, it does give a place a certain sense of significance. But here's the thing, Northampton has another option, and it's an option that most other large towns don't have. Now remember, the lowest level of local government in England is called a parish, but most towns of this size don't have parishes. Instead, they have a higher level council that runs the whole town, and they don't bother splitting things up beyond that. But Northamptonshire's council got reorganised a few years ago, and the middle bit of Northampton was turned into a parish. And that parish is now by far the largest in the country by population. Becoming a parish meant that Northampton got its own parish council, and at their first meeting, that council immediately resolved that Northampton would have the status of a town.
I'm pleased to propose that the council be styled a town council.
It was already informally considered a town because it got one of those market charters all the way back in 1189, but as we've discussed, that doesn't actually matter anymore. So making this declaration meant that Northampton could have a town council, and that it would officially be a town in the same way that Fordwich is officially a town. Which gives me an idea. In order to become a city, they're going to need to convince the UK government to give them that status. But they could much more easily go in the other direction. At any time, Northampton Town Council could simply resolve that the resolution that made them a town shall cease to have effect, at which point they would revert to being simply a parish. But if they wanted to, they could go even further than that, and they could take a step that Lancing hasn't actually done. Under another section of the law, parish councils can decide to adopt an alternative style, meaning they won't be called a parish anymore. Instead, they can be called a community, they can be called a neighbourhood, or they can be called a village. And if Northampton did that, then their parish council would officially be called Northampton Village Council. At which point the village of Northampton, with a population of 140,000, would indisputably usurp Lancing and become the largest village in England by population. This does also go for Fordwich, of course. They're quite happy being Britain's smallest town, but there are countless parishes with lower populations across the country, and at any time, any one of them could just decide to become a town, at which point Fordwich would lose that title. I suppose they would still be the largest town under the old traditional rules. We can talk about cities as well. The smallest city in the UK is St David's in Pembrokeshire with a population of less than 2,000, which means that Britain's largest village has a population more than 10 times the size of its smallest city. So what is a village? What is a town? You can't really put a strict rule on it. If Lancing wants to be a village, if Fordwich wants to be a town, if Northampton doesn't want to go for my plan of becoming the largest village, then that's fine. You can't really come up with universally accepted definitions for these words anyway, so we might as well just let communities decide for themselves. It does seem weird that we gatekeep city status so much in this country, and the way we can kind of force places to enter into the Hunger Games every 10 years or so to try and fight their way up to becoming a city, but weird system. Anyway, Northampton, Fordwich, Lancing. That's my ranking of the weather in each of these places when I visited them to film. Lancing, it was grey, it was windy, it was kind of raining. Fordwich, I just about got away with it. Northampton's kind of all right.